Hurricane is approaching. Part 1. The precursor of the storm. Florida, Taylor County, Perry. September 26, 2024. My name is Jessica. I'm a single mother raising my 6-year-old son, Nick. We live in a small house in Taylor County, just outside Perry, a town most people couldn't find on a map. Our home was simple. Wooden walls, a small yard, toy cars scattered across the lawn. To me, this house was everything. The only refuge where Nick and I felt safe. But safety is an illusion when a force of nature approaches on a scale you can hardly imagine. Warning! The morning of September 26, 2024, began with the soft hum of the television. I woke up before dawn, not because I planned to, but because anxiety had kept me awake. I had been following the news about Hurricane Helena for the past week, but now it was coming straight toward us. Meteorologists initially said it might bypass our area or hit weaker, but in the last few hours, forecasts changed. Now they said the hurricane would strike the Big Bend coastline, right here, where we were. And not just any hurricane. Category 4, winds exceeding 220 kilometers per hour, possible storm surge over 4 meters. I turned up the volume, and the voice of the broadcaster felt cold and emotionless. Residents of Taylor, Dixie, and Levy counties must evacuate immediately. This is the final warning. Anyone remaining in the impact zone risks their life. I shuddered. Mom, are we going to school? Nick asked sleepily, appearing at the kitchen door with his stuffed monkey. I looked at him and tried to smile, but my lips were trembling. No, sweetheart. We're packing. We're leaving. Panic and packing. I tried to think clearly, but my hands wouldn't listen. What to take? How long would we be on the road? Would we have a place to return to? I started hastily throwing things into a duffel bag. Documents. Bottles of water. A few changes of clothes. A flashlight. Nick's allergy medicine. His toy monkey, the one thing he couldn't sleep without. Next to the TV, the radio was playing. The voice of a rescuer, as though from another world, gave dry instructions. You have until midnight at the latest to leave the zone. If you don't leave now, after midnight the roads may be impassable. Remember, rescue services will not be able to help once the hurricane hits. One thought kept spinning in my head. Time is running out. Neighbors. I ran outside. It was still relatively quiet, but the air was growing heavier, and the sky was filling with leaden clouds. Neighbors were running around the street. Some were loading suitcases into cars. Others were boarding up windows with plywood. Elderly Mrs. Daly stood on her porch with a phone, crying. She was waiting for her son to pick her up, but he was stuck in traffic. "Jessica, you're leaving already?" shouted Tom, the neighbor across the street, who was loading a gas canister into his pickup truck. "Yes. Are you too?" As soon as I gathered the kids. "Heard that I-75 is already blocked. We'll have to take the back roads." His words only added to the panic. If the main highway is blocked, what are we supposed to do? The wind. By midday, the wind had intensified. First, it swayed the palm trees, then began ripping branches and breaking boards from the fence. I heard dull thuds. Trees were already beginning to fall. Plastic buckets, bags, and shards of roofing flew through the air. Nick was staring out the window, asking, "Mom, do you think our house will make it?" I squeezed his hand. "Don't think about it. We'll be safe." But even I didn't believe my own words. The departure. My old car, a 2008 Ford truck, didn't start on the first try. I prayed it wouldn't fail us this time. We threw our things in the back and set off. The drive to the highway took nearly an hour. All this time, we crawled in a never-ending stream of cars. People were honking, Some were shouting out of windows. On the side of the road, I saw abandoned cars with open doors. The drivers must have walked away. On the radio, news snippets played. Hurricane Helena is expected to bring deadly storm surges and building destruction. Anyone still at home should seek shelter immediately. Every word tightened my chest. Chaos on the highway. When we reached I-75, it was clear Tom was right. Traffic had practically stopped. Some cars had pulled over to the side. Others were driving on the wrong side of the road, trying to bypass the crowd. The hurricane wasn't here yet, but the rain was already coming down in sheets. Nick sat silently, clutching his stuffed monkey. "Mom, will we make it?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer. Up ahead, one car had stalled in the middle of the traffic. A man and his wife were pulling their kids out and running toward other cars. It was scarier than the news, watching people abandon their cars and run into the rain and wind. I stepped on the gas and drove around them, even though my hands were shaking. Thunder and the first strike. Around 10 p.m., the sky split with thunder. We saw lightning strike a transformer nearby, and half a block plunged into darkness. Then the wind started slamming the car so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. And then it hit me. We could have left yesterday. Why had I waited until the last minute? I squeezed Nick's hand. "It will be okay. I promise." He looked at me with wide eyes and nodded. The final moments. Around midnight, we managed to break free of the traffic jam and reach the junction leading to Jacksonville, the only city still accepting evacuees. The road was flooded, but I didn't stop. Behind us, on the dark horizon, the chaos had already begun. Helena was close, not just the wind, but the roar that sounded like the engines of 1,000 trucks. We pushed forward, knowing the hurricane was already approaching, and there was no going back. Part 2. The Eye of the Storm. Shelter in the unknown. By the time we reached the outskirts of Gainesville, we were exhausted. The highway was a nightmare. Cars were pulled off to the side of the road in every direction. Some had run out of gas. Others were stranded from broken-down engines. The rain was so heavy that the windshield wipers could barely keep up. Visibility was almost zero. I could feel the panic rising again, this time from the deep pits of my stomach. I had no idea where we were going, just that we needed to keep moving. I glanced over at Nick, who had fallen asleep, his toy monkey clutched tightly in his arms. His face, pressed against the window, looked like he was lost in a dream. I envied him. His world was still full of innocence, while mine was collapsing into chaos. I could see the storm in the distance, the swirling black clouds, and the ominous glow of lightning in the sky. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The wind began to whip through the trees as if the storm itself was hungry, eager to devour anything in its path. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. Every minute felt like an hour. I had no real plan, just the instinct to drive, to get as far away from the coast as I could. But the truth was, the storm was relentless. The roads were becoming more and more congested, and there was no clear path forward. I had no idea where we would end up. I kept looking for signs, any sign of shelter. When I finally saw a rundown auto repair shop on the outskirts of the city, I made the decision to pull over. It wasn't much, an old garage with broken windows and a flickering light hanging from the ceiling. But it was a roof over our heads, and at that point, it was all I could hope for. I parked the truck, trying to steady my breath. I was shaking, my nerves on edge. The storm was upon us, and the chaos outside was unbearable. The wind howled like a wild animal, and I could feel the pressure of it against the truck, as though it were trying to push us away. The air was thick with rain, and the ground vibrated with each gust of wind. I turned to Nick, who had woken up now, his eyes wide with fear. His little hands gripped the toy monkey even tighter. "Mom, are we safe?" he asked, his voice small, barely above a whisper. I tried to smile, but it felt forced. "We'll be okay, sweetheart. We'll stay here for the night. It's safer than driving any farther." But the truth was, I didn't know if we were safe. The storm was relentless, and no matter how many people huddled together in this tiny shop, we were all vulnerable. I could hear the distant crack of lightning, and I wondered if it would hit the building next. The walls of the shop groaned under the pressure of the wind. I grabbed Nick, pulling him close, and whispered to him over and over that we would be okay. Though even I wasn't sure anymore. The night of fear. Night fell quickly. The storm was now fully upon us, and the sound of the wind outside was deafening. It was as though the world was coming apart, piece by piece. People huddled together in the dim light, trying to find comfort in the midst of the storm. Some were praying quietly, while others just sat in stunned silence, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. The air in the room grew thick, and it felt like we were all suffocating under the weight of it all. I could hear the faint sound of the radio, crackling through the static. The news broadcasts were growing more urgent, and the fear in the voices of the reporters was palpable. "Helena has intensified. Those who remain in the evacuation zone must find shelter immediately. There are reports of widespread power outages, and rescue efforts are already underway. The storm surge is expected to be catastrophic." I glanced around at the faces in the room. There were parents holding their children, elderly people clutching onto walkers, and people with nothing but the clothes on their backs. We were all strangers, bound together by the same fear, the same desperation to survive. Nick had curled up beside me, his head resting against my shoulder. His eyes were closed, but I could feel his body trembling against mine. I ran my hand through his hair, trying to comfort him as best as I could. But I knew that no words could make him feel safe. Not now. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, as if it were tearing at the very fabric of the building. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a force of nature that was impossible to escape. I could hear the trees outside being ripped from the ground, and I held my breath, waiting for the first sign that something was about to break. Nick stirred in his sleep, and his small voice broke through the chaos. "Mom, will we die?" he asked, his eyes opening, filled with a fear I couldn't hide from. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't lie to him. I didn't have the strength to lie anymore. "We're going to be okay, Nick. We're together. We'll get through this." I held him tighter, trying to block out the howling wind, the banging against the walls, the crashing of debris outside. I could hear the faint sound of a siren in the distance, a reminder that help was out there. But how far away was it? How long would it take for anyone to reach us? The storm raged on through the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't peaceful sleep. Every time the building shook or the wind howled louder, I would jolt awake, my heart racing in my chest. I kept my eyes on Nick, making sure he was still there, still safe, still with me. The morning after. The next morning, the silence was almost worse than the storm itself. The wind had died down, but the aftermath was everywhere. The sky was a dark, bruised color, and the air was thick with humidity. People slowly started to emerge from the shelter of the auto shop, looking around in disbelief at the destruction outside. The ground was littered with debris, fallen trees, broken glass, and twisted metal. The streets were flooded, the water rising higher than anyone expected. The sense of chaos had been replaced with a cold, eerie quiet. Nick looked up at me with wide eyes. "Mom, what happened? Where are we?" I looked down at him, trying to find the right words. But there were no words. All I could do was hold him tighter, hoping that somehow the world outside would become safer. We're safe, baby. For now, we're safe. But I knew it wasn't over. The storm might have passed, but the real fight was just beginning. Part 3: The Relentless Fury. Survival on the brink. The morning after the hurricane felt like a different world. The air was thick with moisture, the humidity unbearable. The sun had risen, but it barely penetrated the overcast sky. I felt as though the world was suffocating. The moment I stepped outside, a damp, stifling heat hit me like a wall. The devastation stretched for miles, but all I could focus on was the truck in front of me, the engine idling as if it too were exhausted from the storm. Nick was still asleep in the back seat, his small form curled up under a blanket, his stuffed monkey tightly in his grip. His breathing was slow, peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil outside. I envied him. He didn't yet understand what had happened, didn't realize the scale of the disaster around us. For him, it was just another bad storm. For me, it was the beginning of something far worse than I ever could have imagined. I knew we couldn't stay here. The building we'd taken refuge in was no longer safe. The floodwaters were already rising, and soon it would be too late to leave. We needed to find higher ground, somewhere that might offer a glimmer of hope. But where? The roads were flooded, and with every hour that passed, they were becoming more impassable. The radio had gone silent, no updates, no emergency broadcasts. We were isolated, cut off from the world. I needed to make a decision, but no matter what I chose, it felt like a gamble. Every option was a risk. I could still hear the sound of the storm in my mind, the howl of the wind, the crashing of trees, the thunder that rattled my bones. It felt like we were living in a nightmare that kept getting worse. Struggling to move forward, I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of panic that clouded my thoughts. The fear was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I had to push it away. I had to be strong for Nick. I couldn't afford to crumble now. I turned to him, gently shaking his shoulder. "Nick, wake up. We need to go." He groggily blinked, his small hand reaching out to rub his eyes. "Mom, what happened? Is it over?" I smiled, though my heart was heavy with fear. "The worst part is over. But we still have to go. We can't stay here. We need to keep moving, okay?" Nick nodded sleepily, his small face still scrunched with confusion. I didn't want him to see how scared I was. I didn't want him to know the truth, that I didn't know if we would make it out of this. But we had to try. We gathered our things and I helped Nick into the front seat. He was still so tired, his head lolling against the window as I started the truck. It took several tries for the engine to roar to life, but it finally sputtered and I sighed with relief. The engine seemed to shudder as if it too were uncertain about what lay ahead. The road outside was eerily quiet. I drove slowly at first, trying to make sense of the landscape around me. The storm had left everything in ruined, flooded streets, destroyed homes, overturned vehicles. I could see the remnants of other families who had evacuated before us, their belongings scattered, abandoned, left behind in the rush to survive. We passed by wrecked houses, some completely submerged, others with only the tops of their roofs visible above the rising water. The smell of wet wood and gasoline filled the air, mixing with the scent of something far worse, fear. I knew we had to find higher ground, but every road I tried seemed blocked or flooded. My stomach churned as I realized how completely helpless we were. The world I had known just 24 hours ago was gone, and in its place was a hostile, unrecognizable landscape. The rising floodwaters. The floodwaters were rising faster than I had anticipated. At first, the water was just a few inches, but now it was creeping up to the tires, moving in a steady stream toward the truck. I pushed the gas pedal harder, urging the engine to give us more speed, but the rising water made every movement feel like we were stuck in molasses. Nick was silent now, staring out the window at the flood that was swallowing everything in its path. I could feel his fear without even needing to look at him. It was a fear that mirrored my own, a fear of the unknown, of what was waiting for us out there. As I drove on, I noticed the occasional figure walking along the side of the road, their belongings bundled in blankets or tied to shopping carts. They were evacuees like us, searching for shelter, for safety, but they didn't look hopeful. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, fear, and resignation. I passed by one woman, an older lady with a cane, holding on to a young boy's hand. She was struggling to move through the rising water, but the boy was trying to pull her along, urging her to hurry. My heart ached for them. How many more families were out there, stranded, abandoned? How many others had no choice but to walk into the storm, to face it head-on? A moment of dread. As we drove farther into the town, the destruction became even more pronounced. Power lines had snapped like brittle twigs, lying across the road like deadly snakes. Buildings had collapsed, their structures reduced to rubble, with twisted metal and concrete scattered everywhere. The storm had not only taken away our homes, it had taken the very foundation of our lives. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look too long at the devastation around us. If I stopped, if I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep going. I had to keep moving for Nick. He needed me. But then, just as I thought we might be able to make it to higher ground, disaster struck again. The truck lurched forward, the wheels spinning in place, and I realized we were stuck. The floodwaters had risen too high, too quickly. I cursed under my breath, slamming my hands against the steering wheel. I was trapped. The truck was too old, too unreliable. I wasn't sure how long we could stay there before the water reached us. Panic flooded through me, threatening to consume everything I had left. Nick looked at me with wide eyes, his voice shaking. "Mom, are we gonna drown?" His question hit me harder than I was prepared for. I had promised him we would be okay, but right now, it didn't feel like I could keep that promise. I swallowed hard, trying to sound confident, though my voice was tight. "No, baby. We won't drown. We just need to get out of here." I reached over and grabbed his hand, pulling him close. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't let him see my fear. Not now. Not when he needed me most. I put the truck in reverse, my hands shaking as I tried to back up, but the water was too deep. The wheels spun uselessly, and I could feel the truck's engine sputtering, fighting against the rising flood. The moment of decision. The fear was palpable. I could see the water creeping higher, closer. I knew that if we didn't get out now, we might be swept away. But where could we go? Every route was blocked. There was no escape. In that moment, I realized how truly powerless we were. The storm had taken everything: our home, our possessions, even our ability to control our fate. We were just two small figures, lost in a sea of chaos, desperately clinging to the hope that we would survive. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I slammed my foot on the accelerator one more time. The engine roared to life, and I prayed it would be enough. We needed to move. Now. And with one final surge, the truck lurched forward, out of the rising water. A glimmer of hope. As the truck rolled onto a slightly elevated patch of road, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The water was still rising, but at least for now, we were out of immediate danger. We had survived the worst of it. But I knew this was far from over. The storm had passed, but we were still in the midst of a nightmare. Our lives had been ripped apart in a matter of hours, and we had no idea what the future held. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I had a small flicker of hope. We were alive, and as long as we were alive, there was still a chance to rebuild, to survive. I looked over at Nick, his face pale but calm, his hand still tightly gripping mine. For a moment, everything felt like it might just be okay. But deep down, I knew we had only scratched the surface of what lay ahead, and I wasn't sure if we could survive whatever came next. Part 4. The calm after the storm. A new reality. By the time we reached Jacksonville, the city was barely recognizable. The skyline that once stood proudly above the horizon was now shrouded in a thick veil of smoke and dust. The streets were flooded, the sidewalks lined with debris, and the air was heavy with the scent of destruction. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of devastation. Broken windows, shattered glass, fallen trees, and abandoned vehicles. We had made it to safety, or so I thought. But as I drove deeper into the city, I realized that the calmness that followed the storm wasn't as reassuring as it seemed. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. Only the distant sound of sirens and the occasional crash of falling debris broke the suffocating silence. Nick had fallen asleep again, his head resting against the window. I couldn't help but watch him, his small face relaxed, unaware of the full extent of what we had just endured. How much longer could I protect him from this? How much longer could I shield him from the horrors of this new world? I didn't have answers, but I had one thing: determination. I wasn't going to let this storm take away the last thing I had, my son. The struggle to survive. The roads were impassable, the floodwaters swallowing the streets whole. Every turn I made felt like a step deeper into a maze of chaos and destruction. But I couldn't stop. We couldn't stop. Not now. I finally managed to find a shelter. It was a small temporary emergency station set up by the National Guard, with tents and makeshift barriers surrounding it. There were a few other evacuees already there, huddling together for warmth, but I could sense their unease. The fear in their eyes mirrored my own. We were all the same, just people trying to survive a disaster that no one was prepared for. I pulled the truck to a stop and climbed out, my legs shaky from the adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins for days. I grabbed Nick's hand and helped him out of the truck, feeling the weight of the world bearing down on me. As we entered the shelter, a wave of relief washed over me. The atmosphere was chaotic, but it was still safe. People were speaking in hushed tones, their faces pale from exhaustion, their clothes damp and covered in mud. I tried to ignore the overwhelming sense of defeat that was settling in my chest. This was it, the end of the line.